Welcome everybody, this is Tim Watrous, President of Digital Advisors.
And this is Kevin Gordon, President of Capital Advisors Group.
We'd like to welcome you to our K-12 Politics and Tech video series.
Our objective is to give you the absolute latest of what's going on in Sacramento that affects public school districts, obviously, and as well as all the technology stuff that's going on that's so vital to delivering for kids these days.
And remember, if you find these videos useful, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and share out over social media. You're our marketing team. We appreciate your support, and let's go ahead and get started.
All right, welcome everybody. Tim Watrous, President of Digital Advisors, back with another episode of K-12 Politics and Tech. As always, Kevin Gordon, President of Capital Advisors, co-host of the show, joining us. Kevin, glad you're here.
Hey, Tim, good to be with you.
Yeah, and we have a very special first-time guest with us today, Edgar Salsueta from ACSA, Government Relations Expert Extraordinaire. Edgar, glad you're joining us today.
Hey, thanks for the invite. No, this will be fun. I appreciate you guys reaching out.
Yeah, no, we got a lot to cover as always. And Edgar, let's go ahead and start with you. We saw some, in-person guidance from the state. There's been a little bit of confusion around that. We're real glad you're here to explain. But can you fill us in on what's going on with that in-person guidance, just so we can get some clarity?
Yeah, this is definitely the issue of the day here in the field. So I think just to set a little bit of the context, the governor, as we've known for some months, he's facing some political issues in terms of this issue of school reopenings, right? That communities, as the longer the pandemic has gone, they've been hearing more from parents, from community members, from educators about some frustration about what is the status of school reopening, but more so, what is the state's role in that? So a little before New Year, the governor kind of channeled that he was going to put out a pretty aggressive plan as part of his budget to try to incentivize in-person instruction. And just last week, in conjunction with that, they put in a new set of California Department of Public Health guidelines, which makes a number of changes and recommendations around testing cadences, how often you have to test, provide some clarity in terms of physical distancing in classrooms, who's considered open, who's considered closed. So the intent is good. Here's the flip side of that. I think it's caused a lot of confusion in the field in terms of what am I supposed to be doing now? The governor last week from the messaging piece, as part of his budget, puts out, here's some incentive grants. Here are the things that we want you to do in order to be eligible for these grants, namely test students and staff more often, which is probably the piece that's getting the most attention there. Also, this issue of even for schools that are open, in order to be eligible for the grants, there's an expectation that they go back and collectively bargain new agreements with their stakeholders. So as you can imagine, that's causing a little bit of angst. And then some of the timelines are just really aggressive. The state was talking about February 1st in order to make some of this available. So we already had that context before the state put out this new health guidance. And the health guidance is intended to be helpful, right? What should we be doing? What are the mitigation strategies? But I think it's having a bit of a chilling effect, especially for those schools that have already opened. There's a lot of questions of, hey, I've been open, even though all the attention and a lot of times the headlines are around the big districts that haven't been able to open. If you look at numbers, we actually had a pretty good amount of school districts, especially some of the smaller districts in some areas where they didn't have the transmission rates as bad as some of the urban districts. And so there's this question, wait a minute, we've been able to demonstrate that we've been able to open and stay open and open safely. And now is the state asking us to go back and kind of redo our plan? So I say that there's a lot of angst there in terms of what are these requirements? What do I have to do? What do I have to do if I'm going for this grant? So we're just beginning this, even though the governor has set some aggressive timelines on when this is going to happen. I'm not sure that the legislature is necessarily on board on every single aspect of this.
Yeah. And the politics are that I think what they kind of missed a little bit was this crunch on the timelines. It was interesting after we articulated the timeline problem, both in terms of the politics and the legislative process, but also the timeline issues and the logistics for school districts are both problems. The nonpartisan legislative analyst actually, in one of the only comments they made about the governor's proposal was about the unrealistic timeline. So for the political one, which is that the legislature, the governor had announced this and the legislature wasn't even back yet. They had delayed their return. So when you took a look at the month of January and how compressed it might be, the notion of them taking action, which might actually even be possible before this month is over, that they might actually take action, early action on something. But then the issue of the time gap between the legislature acting and school districts getting the extra guidance they need to turn around an application by February 1st, really a steep climb. So all of those logistics. So that's the combination of those timelines are a problem. The other things that I was going to mention, Edgar, was some of the things that we're getting the most questions on relate to them districts trying to figure out what are the rules for if I want to participate in the grant program, $2 billion and what their share would be. And then what are the rules if you're not in that program and you're just continuing to be open. The bottom line is no matter what your school safety plan is that you had in place, you're going to have to redo it. You're going to have to modify it and pay attention to that revised guidance that Cal OSHA and the California Department of Public Health have instituted to modify that. So that's going to have to happen for sure. Little changes that they made in the guidance, like the idea of the caseloads being, the metric went from 28 per 100,000 that was an indicator of really a zone that you had to be under, to 25 per 100,000. Just those little changes like that were the kind of things that I thought sort of needlessly complicated everything. And I know they're trying to operate based on science, but again, it becomes a moving target and a source of a lot of frustration in districts.
Yeah, you remind me, Kevin, and it's one of the reasons that us at ACSA, in collaboration with a number of our partners, and Capital Advisors has been helpful on this front, been working with CSBA, with the school board, with the County Superintendents Association, the school business officials, and the Small Districts Association. We realized, hey, let's put something out here in a collaborative fashion. Let's try to tell the state, one, let's make sure we take a very deliberate approach. Let's tell them some of the things that we think are helpful. There is some things that are helpful, right? And even though the reaction has been, hey, we can't do all of this, we like that they're moving away from the elementary school waiver, because we saw some inequities around the state. Some counties were considering those, some weren't. So we think that's a good thing. We like the fact that they're asking for data in terms of who's open, who's not. That's something that parents and community have been looking for. The state doesn't even have a good sense right now of what the schools in the state reopening status are. So starting next week, they're going to start collecting that data. But with that said, we also thought it's important to very deliberately tell the state, tell the governor, tell the legislature, here are some of the issues. And you just touched on those, Kevin, the whole notion of testing and these frequencies. Does that make sense in every community? The impact on open schools, as I was talking about, knowing that some of them have already opened, does it make sense to have them go and do all these requirements? And then there's some collective bargaining issues in terms of just forcing folks back to the table. That could have some unintended consequences of folks that had been successful in finding agreement. We may take a step backwards. And then the last issue, which we think is a real important one, is it appropriate to use Prop 98 education funds for health purposes? Because essentially that's what the state's asking us to do, to use academic educational dollars for things like COVID testing, for public health needs. And we think that there, from a policy standpoint, that's a consideration the legislature should really take up.
Yeah. And I think a couple of things. One is I think the governor set himself up a little bit for failure by having such an accelerated date of February 1 application deadline, when the truth is he should have waited a little bit to see what was going to happen with regard to the Biden plan and what happened in that Georgia election, to see whether or not he was going to have some traction relative to a stimulus plan that would take up the slack on some of this money. That $2 billion is not only a problem because it's Prop 98, but almost unquestionably not enough money to pay for the mandates that are in the proposal. It just doesn't pay for itself. And to the administration's credit, they point to these other pots of money that we're getting, that we're already getting, some that we will get, to say money won't be a problem. But the point is, you don't propose a proposal like this and not have answers to how it all gets paid for. They've talked about Medicaid and insurance and other things, but all of those things are just theory. None of it's rock solid about how it gets paid for. But I will tell you this, today we are expecting action by the Biden administration that's going to address the issue of and it's interesting because you start to see the fingerprints of Linda Darling Hammond, who is our state board president, who is the chief advisor to Biden on his transition at the U.S. Department of Ed. The idea that the Department of Health and Human Services at the federal level, the U.S. Department of Education, will work together on joint guidance issued nationally. I'll bet you it's going to look a lot like the work that was done here in California. So that's going to come out. And then also he will sign today, it's expected, an order to FEMA that we reopen the idea of payment for all the PPE, cleaning supplies, those kind of things that the prior administration had actually stopped funding on, because he's basically saying, no, the crisis is not over. We are in the middle of an emergency that continues. And of course, FEMA money should be able to be used. That'll open up another avenue for some money. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about the president's stimulus package in a minute.
Yeah, one last thought on this issue that, and I think you hit it, Kevin, is at the end of the day, some of this is going to change, but I think we fully expect that there's going to be some action, right? And I think that's the message to the field, that there's going to be something that happens, both for health reasons, for political reasons, and then the context of what's happening back east with the new administration. We expect some action. Some of this may evolve, so we'll just have to wait and see.
We're hearing that we could see action by the state legislature as early as next Thursday. But think about next Thursday leaves you 3 days. 3 days if he was to get everything, which he won't, for school districts to make application. That doesn't work. So almost for sure, you can expect some of these deadlines to move.
Well, thanks you two for breaking that down. And Edgar, thanks for all the great work you're doing in that regard for the schools in the state of California. So we appreciate all that work you're doing. I just want to, I know we're going to switch over to DC. And on that note, everyone has heard, of course, about the incident at the White House recently, the security incident. There's actually a data security incident as well, because many devices were stolen out of the offices of very prominent leaders. And, you know, there's actually a little nugget that you can take home as a school district leader from this. And you have to ask yourself the question, what happens if my laptop is stolen? What happens if one of my admin colleagues' laptop is stolen, a teacher's laptop or a student's laptop that is tied into all these data sets that run your district every day? And if the answer is you're not sure, there are ways that you can remotely wipe devices. One of the nice things is when these devices left the White House, they were immediately known that they were missing. They were trying to do an inventory of all those devices. The devices that were missing, they were remotely wiped. And that is a necessary thing in today's world when you have students and staff working from home and offices. Something like this is bound to happen. You want to have the ability to basically try to locate the device and then wipe that device if it's missing or in the wrong hands. So if you don't have any thoughts or you're not certain, please ask your team. And then if you need any help with that, of course, this is something we help with our clients with on a regular basis. We're happy to assist you in that. So with that, we're transitioning back over to DC. And Edgar, I just want to ask you, we saw Biden come out with a very comprehensive, a large, additional stimulus has been proposed. Can you break that down and give us a little bit of information as far as you see it?
Well, I think just like what Kevin was saying earlier, I think some of the political ramifications here of just where we landed in terms of who's controlling the Senate, I think are huge, right? Because the new president is proposing now what's the number, Kevin?
$1.9 trillion.
$1.9 trillion, right? So of that, they're proposing a lot of support that frankly, we hadn't been able to see under the old administration. Some of the issues like providing direct support to local states, cities, which obviously is going to have a trickle-down effect in terms of our schools in California. As Kevin was mentioning, some of this support around COVID as part of the plan, providing resources for schools to reopen, and thinking about vaccine distribution, thinking about COVID testing. So I think that the fact that the politics now have slided where the Democrats will have the ability to push something through, Now, one of the interesting parts is anybody that listened to President Biden's inauguration speech, he's really touching on trying to get bipartisan support. The Republicans wasted no time in saying, a number of them, that, hey, some of this is way too much. We don't like the price tag. We're overreaching here. So it'll be interesting to see how much of this they will just push through. The Democrats have the numbers now. With Kamala Harris, they can break the tie. Now, whether they'll try to negotiate some of this, again, almost like the state front, some of this package may change, but they have the ability to push things through, where that was in question a couple weeks ago before the results of the Georgia runoff came through.
Yeah. I mean, I think the one thing that's a little dicey is that when you have margins as thin as they are now in the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, anybody can be a troublemaker. So herding all of those cats is not going to be easy, but to the extent they can get their act together, maybe there's a possibility that they can lead on some of these issues. The example is that Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, has suggested that he's not for a package that's quite this big. And then you get across the aisle some of our Republicans that are, our Alaska, New Hampshire, U.S. senators who actually might end up being the vote on it instead of Joe Manchin. So there's going to be kind of a mixed bag of who comes in and out of these deals, but it's going to take a lot of nimbleness. The thing that's going for Biden is the fact that he comes out of the U.S. Senate and has a whole lot of experience with that kind of negotiating. But let me tell you one thing for an example. When Governor Newsom did his budget last summer, he hitched the budget in some ways to the hope that we get about $14 billion. We would net $14 billion in California from what would be a state and local government aid package. The package never happened. We never got a component for state and local government support. And most of you know that was one of the sticking points. Every time they would make progress on a major stimulus package, it would be that state and local piece that we didn't get. And it was President Trump who knew that a majority of that money would end up going to blue states, and he didn't like that. So it just never ended up being in the final package. This package, well, first of all, the biggest package that was ever proposed for state and local government was $160 billion under the HEROES Act that Speaker Pelosi had authored. This package has $350 billion for state and local government assistance. For California, we probably get somewhere close to 10% of that. The notion that we would end up with something close to $35 billion infused into education would be, into our budget for the state of California would be huge. You couple on top of that the education proposal, which in this proposal would be $170 billion, $130 billion coming to K-12 education, roughly $13 billion more for schools in California, probably channeled through Title I like the other packages have been. And then finally, the last piece, $50 billion on testing and vaccines. And he talks about testing cadences for schools. Think about that in terms of if we get roughly about 10% of that, if we ended up with $5 billion, how that stands in comparison to the governor's proposal of $2 billion. And it reinforces the idea that maybe the governor leapt out there a little too quickly, because that $5 billion is the source of money that ought to be paying for this testing, not Prop 98 money that the governor's proposing. So hopefully there's a mix and there's action that's quick enough by Congress to act. I heard yesterday there's some potential that we might not see a package out of Congress and the president till March. It would be surprising to me for them to wait that long, but it might actually be that long before we get some action for them. And I could see for the governor, he's got a political imperative with the recall stuff lurking around, which I'm not so sure that's going to pan out, but it does lurk in the political background as motivation for the governor to address one of the most biggest sticking points that he's criticized for, getting schools reopened.
Kevin, you bring up a point where there's a connection here on what's happening in back east and some of the proposals that we were talking at the state level. So, for example, their shift here on their emphasis on COVID testing for both students and staff, right? You just talked about some of the federal proposal. Again, making that connection, Linda Darling-Hammond was leading the transition team on education, right? So it's no surprise that they are trying to be in line there. And to your point, the timing may have been a little suspect because having the president, the new president, kind of within his honeymoon period, take the lead on that might have been a little more politically beneficial here in California. But I do think that some of the shifts that we've seen even here in our state are probably California trying to be in line with what they already assumed was going to be coming down from the federal government.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on that for sure.
One of the strange things to me about this is every other proposed stimulus has come out with a pretty good framework of what's involved and how the dollars would be spent. This one's been very general, and I know you've been doing a lot of digging, so thank you for that breakdown, Kevin. But we don't have the detail on this one that we've seen in others. As we get more, particularly on technology type stuff, aspects of this new stimulus, we'll be sharing that with you as well. But again, thanks you two for breaking that down for us. Just back on the technology front, every year there's a big consumer electronics show called CES. CES happened a couple of weeks ago, and there were some education-specific products that were revealed that are very compelling. As you all know, everyone was like hunting for devices, desperate for devices, and the laptop shortage. That has calmed down a bit. There are a lot of new devices that have been released that are very inexpensive. They're ruggedized. They have touch screens. They have longer battery life, faster processors. And I just want to reiterate one thing: as you're receiving this new round of stimulus dollars, is probably hitting your bank account shortly. You're able to replace maybe some of those older devices that you've had, standardize on new types of devices. Definitely take a look around at what's just been announced at CES, and keep in mind, always prioritize a laptop that has an LTE hotspot capability built in. This gives you the flexibility to not have to track or worry about an external device to connect that laptop. Just a little chip that goes right in, and then the laptop acts as its own hotspot, right? There's going to be a premium to pay for that, but you don't have to inventory, track, or manage or support an additional device. I believe that's totally worthwhile. And I'll just reiterate, if you haven't taken the time to kind of just poke your head up and look around, at new technologies that might support you, there's been a lot of great changes. We'll get into a couple more of those as we move on. But it's definitely time to reevaluate some of the hardware that you've got deployed out to your staff and students. There's some wonderful new options that are in stock, and it's a great time to start considering that. So with that, sorry, go ahead.
Well, one of the things that occurred to me, Tim and Edgar, is that about a year from now, I mean, we'll probably start talking about it now, but about a year from now, one of the things that we're going to want to be talking about in the governor's budget, getting ahead of ourselves here, is that notion that we will not go backward relative to the deployment of devices and hotspots for kids. That's going to become a permanent part of the infrastructure we're going to be delivering in education. But one of the things that we're going to need the legislature and the governor to do is make sure that the resources are there for the recycle process of making sure we've got devices and that sort of thing. These things only last. The technology changes so rapidly. The guidance, and you've drilled this into me, Tim, is about a 3 to 4 year time span when you have to cycle through new devices. We need to budget for that. And in an era where we've really gotten away from categorical programs and we use LCFF, that could be a huge burden on LCFF if there is not some sort of separate investment for that purpose. So it's something we will be talking about probably a year from now, I suspect.
Yeah, so it'll be an ongoing topic, and I know you're covering a lot of this in your budget workshops that are going on this week, Kevin. So keep up the good work there. And there's new leadership in the Department of Education. Edgar, can you fill us in on some of the news there?
Yeah, this is a huge sense of pride here for not only ACSA, but I think for our broader education community. So first, as President Biden unveiled his cabinet picks over the last couple months since the election, there's a lot, obviously in our world, there was a big question about what direction would he go in terms of Secretary of Education. And given Dr. Jill Biden, his wife, as an educator, we knew they were channeling what are the components they were looking for. They wanted somebody who had experience as an educator, experience as a classroom teacher. Obviously, from our perspective, we wanted to see somebody with administrative assistance, with educational leadership experience there. And so they landed on Miguel Cardona, who's the new Secretary of Education. And he has an interesting background where he's from Connecticut. He was their state commissioner there. But before that, he was actually a deputy superintendent and hadn't been out of the classroom or at the site for too long. Experience as a principal, as a teacher. So we thought that, oh, okay, that's an interesting pick. That's a good one. We were happy about that. And then subsequently, here just like this week, we got news that really excited us that Cindy Martin, who's currently the superintendent of San Diego Unified, big friend of ACSA, one of our members, part of our leadership, has really etched out an important place here, even in our policy world. She's often called upon by the governor and by the state superintendent to be leaders of task force and whatnot. And so she was tapped to be the new deputy secretary of education, which is a huge deal. Going back to this piece about California's influence, it's going to be night and day in terms of where we're at now as compared to the previous administration. Just to have somebody back there who really knows California schools, who really understands the challenges that we're facing. They have some big decisions coming forth, not just on the funding piece that Kevin was talking about, but questions of what are we going to do with assessments? What are we going to do with testing this spring? Well, Cindy's influence back there, I think is going to be huge. So it was a prideful week for us at ACSA, but I think for just our broader California education community, that one of our own is taking a very senior position in the Biden administration.
I had texted Cindy and I let her know. I said, you know that a lot of people out here in California don't know that the deputy kind of runs the show. Is that it's good for everybody to know that in sort of the hierarchy of U.S. departments, there is the secretary who does a lot of good speeches and certainly provides important leadership at the department. But the deputy secretary is often looked to and across all of these different agencies as the person who really runs the department on a day-to-day basis. Very important position. You'll hear the title assistant secretary. There's almost 6 assistant secretaries, all of them definitely important. 1 deputy secretary. There's also an undersecretary position, which has not been named yet. And the undersecretary of education typically has a portfolio that focuses on higher education. So this deputy secretary pick of Cindy Martin is extraordinarily significant in terms of the impact that she's going to be able to have and the interaction, frankly, that she'll have with the White House. A lot more contact and very, very top leadership level opportunities for Cindy in that role than there would be, for example, if she was an assistant secretary. So yeah, I have a lot of excitement about that very significant appointment of our California local superintendent to that post.
Definitely a good day for our state.
Yep. I will also mention, and it was in a piece today by the San Francisco Chronicle, that we also now have 2 California women in the second and third positions of succession to the presidency of the United States. That is an interesting development, of course, with Kamala Harris and also our speaker in top leadership roles back in Washington, D.C.
Good point.
Well, thanks you two for sharing that. And you may have mentioned it, Edgar. If you did, I apologize, but I'll just reiterate. Dr. Cindy Martin, she had a very unusual path to superintendency, was basically like elevated right out of a classroom to the superintendency of one of the largest districts in the United States. And she handled that position with grace. And as you mentioned, she's been a wonderful supporter of education in the state. So we're thrilled to have her representing our state back in DC in this important role. And with that, I mentioned a little bit earlier, we've seen some changes in technology. One of the most positive, I believe, is some of the larger companies like Oracle and Google really doubling down on their efforts to enhance accessibility. And anyone who has tried to support remote learners, remote staff with any sort of impairments, you immediately hit this wall of trying to serve everyone with devices that are not built always to support people with maybe hearing challenges, sight challenges, and others. So there's a renewed effort to focus on this, to support people who are working and learning from home. And again, when you start to evaluate the types of tools that you have out in the market, know that there are more devices coming with more accessibility features that have been available in the past. There are new accessibility features that you may simply be able to turn on in platforms like Zoom and some of the learning platforms that you may have available. So take a moment, really think about that. Look for more of these positive changes, and frankly, squeak the wheel and ask for more, because there's a lot of work to be done. But again, there's been some positive momentum on that front, and we look to see more of that. And with that, Edgar, I know you have one of the biggest events of the year coming up with ACSA superintendents. Can you tell us a little about the conference that's coming up and any surprises we might want to know about?
Yeah, in January, this is a big one for us. So, like so many things in the midst of the pandemic, we had to change course, right? Everybody, for our superintendents, have attended one of our highlight conferences of the year is going down to Monterey and having our superintendent symposium. Obviously, with the restrictions we have in place, we had to go the virtual route, as we've had to do with many of our events. And while there's the inclination to be like, oh, we don't get to go into the beautiful weather, the beautiful facility, not to mention the networking piece. Once we kind of got over that, we really tried to think about what are the opportunities that we have now having the conference be virtual. And we're going to have a variety of recorded live sessions, trying to put things on demand, trying to take into account how this best works for our members. So we're kind of excited with the final schedule and the agenda we're going to be able to put forth for our superintendents. And we have some pretty special guests. So as we typically do, we have the state superintendent, Tony Thurman, who's going to be with us. And so we're excited about that. And just this week, and this is kind of breaking news, Governor Gavin Newsom has agreed to come and speak to our superintendents, which is a first. Given everything we talked about earlier in the show, I think this is great timing, right? It'll be an interesting conversation, given that we don't agree necessarily on everything. But I think the governor should be applauded to coming forth and having a dialogue with really the leaders who are running our school system around the state. So he's agreed to come and not just have not just do a speech, but the idea is to have a fireside chat where he's going to take questions from our members. So for those that haven't signed up for Soup Symposium, if there was already a lot of incentive before, I would say just getting the governor on board and being able to interact and interface with our state's leader. Hopefully that's the final push to get folks to register for the conference next week.
Absolutely. And I'll just say, if there's a virtual option for the aquarium dinner, I'm in on that as well. It's like one of the things like I miss when you think about what we're missing today in education, where we miss connecting with our friends. Always one of the highlights of the year. But congratulations on sounds like a wonderful agenda. And, obviously Tony Thurman, Gavin Newsom. I hear there's a very special guest appearance from Kevin Gordon planned as well. So we won't miss that.
Kevin Gordon, that's still a staple. That it wouldn't be Symposium without Kevin Gordon there. So we're excited to have him back.
Absolutely. Well, hey, I just want to call out one more time. Kevin and team have been doing this governor's budget workshop all week. And Kevin, thank you so much for making the time to be here with us today. I believe there's still a couple of events happening, tomorrow. If you get this Friday morning, you'll have an opportunity to log in and register. So we'll put the link there just in case, and you'll be able to maybe catch one of the final events for the week. But with that, Kevin, any final thoughts before we wrap up today?
Nope, I think we covered it. Thanks.
Okay. And Edgar, any final thoughts from you?
Thanks for having me. We'll put out some links if folks have information about our advocacy, about our conferences. So appreciate having me on.
Great. Thanks, Edgar, very much.
Yeah, and real quick, just so everybody knows, the links that Edgar's mentioning will be below the video in YouTube. If you want to click into the notes there, you'll also be getting an email if you're a Capital Advisors client with all the available links as well. And Edgar and Kevin, thank you so much for joining us and sharing all the great wisdom this week. And we'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Yep.
All right. Thank you.
So thanks again for joining us for another week of this broadcast.
And I just want to take a moment to remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and share this out over social media. Again, you're our marketing team. I'll also finish by saying, if you have some questions, please send them our way. We'd be happy to address them on a future broadcast. So with that, thanks everybody, and we'll talk soon.